When I did this talk at the funeral service in the church, it was accompanied by a reading of some verses of Psalm 103 and a reading of some verses of Romans 8. So Muriel grew up on a small farm. It was somewhere between 20 and 30 acres. And she grew up on that farm with her mother and father and with her brother Cecil, her sister Violet, and her brother George. And it amazes me to think that 6 people were sustained on such an incredibly small plot of land, as many were at that time, but wouldn't be able to be sustained now. The area, the townland, was known as Tullantrain. It was 2 miles outside the village of Claudy, which is in County Derry, but on the border of County Tyrone. It was very much a rural setting. It was a mixed farm in that they kept between 6 and 8 cows that were milked by hand. The main cash crop was flax. They grew flax. They kept pigs, hens, ducks, sheep, goats, geese. They would have grown potatoes. They had a good garden of vegetables, and all of this was worked by horses. So it really was a very different life to the one that most of us know. And she loved that life. That really was a time of great joy for Muriel, growing up living on the farm. And she loved this despite the fact that there was an incredible amount of work to keep that going. And an example of this is that she would get up, and before she would go to school, she would help her mother milk the cows. And as I say, that was done by hand. She was definitely a child of a very different world, a very different Ireland. You know, although it was a small farm, they weren't particularly poor. They probably weren't very well off, but they weren't poor either. They always had plenty to eat and clothes to wear and all the rest. But in the summertime, when the weather was good, she would walk 2 miles to school along with her brother, 2 brothers and her sister, and indeed other children in the community. They would walk the 2 miles to school, and she would walk in her bare feet. And sometimes she used to tell me she would get maybe a sharp stone would cut her foot, and then she would get an infection there. And her uncle, who was a GP, he would lance this infected area to drain out the pus. Well, not very nice, but it just gives you some idea of the type of upbringing that she had. And when I think on it, that, you know, there was a person alive up to a few days ago who lived that kind of life. And perhaps I got frustrated at times when she just couldn't really handle a mobile phone. It's not a bit wonder. She grew up without electric and without any of these mod cons. Now, this townland of Tullantrain, it was a tight-knit rural community. She knew everybody in that community and was related to a good few of them. Before she was married, her surname was Leslie, and it was an area where there were 2 main families, the Leslies and the Aikens. She enjoyed the really strong sense of community, and her young people would gather into their house in an evening, and they would tell stories and have lots of fun, and they would be out in the fields in the evening. She really did enjoy that country, living in that country life. And as I say, I think it was probably the happiest phase of her life. She absolutely adored her father. And I think this accounts for her love of farming. Her father was Willie Leslie, and he was actually a good bit older than his wife, who was his second wife. And so he was a fairly elderly when she was quite young, but very active in his farming. And she loved him so much that wherever he was, she was. So that's how she really enjoyed the farming life. She adored animals, and that created a bit of a conflict actually, because she never would have sent any animal to the abattoir to be turned into meat. And she just loved animals, and throughout her life she loved her pets, her cats, her dogs, anything like this. Now, we would all know her as a kind of quiet, placid person, which she was. But from what she says, as a child she was mischievous and did all sorts of weird and wonderful things. One of them is that herself and her brother got pipes, clay pipes, and they filled the clay pipes. They went out into the shed where the peats were kept for cooking and heating, and they gathered up the mould and they put it in the pipes and decided they would smoke this. It made them really, really ill, properly ill. And for the rest of her life, she couldn't donate blood because of the problems that arose from that incident. She also was great for shaving cats and dogs, and her father would look at these poor animals and scold no end because of what she had done to them. And she always talked about going to school. They would go through the fields and they had to cross a little river which had, for a bridge, a plank really, and she would like to wait till her brother was in the middle of the river and then give it a good shake. So she was mischievous. Now, moving on from her childhood, she met and married George Heath. And despite the fact that both of them were great storytellers, they never told me how they met or anything like that. Now, George had a loose connection with the Methodist Church. And so when Muriel married George, and they married in a Methodist church, Muriel had an equally loose connection with the Methodist Church. To be really honest, church attendance wasn't very much part of their lives. They went now and then, enough just to kind of show a face and no more than that. Now, despite the fact that they were quite not very well connected in their church life, they ended up working for the local Methodist church because the church had a hostel for men who had alcohol problems, and it still does actually. And they worked there for about 2 years. George was the warden and Muriel was the cook, and they loved working there and enjoyed the men and enjoyed the whole environment. But unfortunately, the pay was really, really poor, and they then felt it was time to move on. Now, before George did that, he had been a shopkeeper, so Muriel married a shopkeeper, and George then was a shopkeeper for the rest of his life after this time. Muriel married a shopkeeper, and she herself became a shopkeeper. She did work in the various shops that George ran, but she never really became involved in the running of those businesses. George did all the running of the businesses, all the decision making and so forth, and in truth he did it pretty badly. And she would scold. What she did do was scold a lot about some of the weird and wonderful business decisions that George would make. One of George's great weaknesses was that salesmen would come to the shop in those days. They sold all sorts of things, little groceries, a little fruit and vegetables, but mostly tobacco products and sweets, lots of sweets actually. And so a salesman would come for sweets, or a salesman would come for fruit and so forth. But actually, sometimes people would come to sell George crazy things. Like one time, a consignment of paint of who knows what colour. And George was so confident in his own ability to sell things, he would buy anything, great quantities of anything. Muriel would scold about this, but actually it was that weakness that caused Muriel to be introduced to me. You see, one day, a social worker who was really desperate to get a home for a homeless 10-year-old, he came to the shop because he'd met George and Muriel when they were in the hostel for the men that were in trouble. And he knew them. And so he just came to the shop. That's the only place you would find George. And he basically sold me to George. And so it was through that great weakness that so much good happened in my life. And I would love to have been there whenever George was then saying to Muriel, as he often did when he bought crazy things, but then saying to Muriel, do you know, we're taking in a 10-year-old and we're going to look after him and we're going to do it for the rest of our lives. And Muriel got on board with that. And she didn't maybe scold so much about that. And so out of all of that, I got a stable, caring home in the country. And I, who was really from the town, just loved being in the country. Now I want to go back to her father. Her father was different from basically everybody in the community that he was living in. You see, all the people in that community went to the Church of Ireland, or if they didn't go, they said that's where they belonged. But her father, he had he went to a Brethren church. He was Brethren and went to a gospel hall. He had probably grown up Church of Ireland, but had come into a real and vibrant experience of Jesus Christ, accepted Christ as his Saviour, and went along then to the Gospel Hall. Now, I'm sure he would have prayed for all his neighbours, and he certainly prayed for his family. And what fascinates me is that in relation to his family, coming to know Jesus for themselves, having a relationship with him, none of his prayers were answered in his lifetime. Yet after he died, his wife, in her grief, turned to Christ, turned to Jesus, and she then also attended the gospel hall that her husband had attended, and that was wonderful. That was a prayer answered after his death. And then his daughter Muriel, she gave her life to Christ in her 50s, many, many years after her father had died. That prayer was answered, and that may encourage some others, some of you, if you're praying for family. It happened because of a health crisis. She was in the Royal Victoria Hospital for major surgery. The chaplain came along to her bedside and chatted with her and asked her, did she have a relationship with Jesus? Was she walking with Jesus? And she said no. And he suggested that she could have a relationship, and they prayed together. Actually, the porters had come to take her towards surgery, and they prayed in the corridor that she would commit her life to Christ, and that was very real. And for the rest of her life, she followed Christ. That brother and father of hers had an influence that was really all through her life. She loved going to church, but she didn't like it too churchy, is the way I would put it. She wasn't one for a lot of ceremony. She didn't want any clergy wearing fancy clothes or any of that kind of thing. She liked it plain and simple and more about Jesus than anything else. When it came to preaching, she had a really clear idea of what was good preaching and what wasn't. And for her, what was good preaching was biblical and contained a challenge encouraging people to follow Jesus. And that was all through her life then. And she would have talked to me about those things. Muriel was not very good at telling people what was on her mind. But because I phoned her every day, she would talk to me about these things. And she would tell me these things. One of her great sayings was, "You need to be ready to meet your Maker." She would often say that. You need to be ready to meet your Maker. And she was aware that not everybody wanted to hear that. And that many of her old fogies, as I used to call them, they rejected this and they didn't like to hear this. But she would say it. And she would say, you need. In other words, this is something that we have to do for ourselves. And she wondered, why was it that people just wouldn't surrender their lives to Jesus? And I think it is because we have a wrong idea of what our Maker is like. And that's why we had a reading of Psalm 103. The Lord is gracious and compassionate. He is abounding in love and slow in anger. And it talks about, so that's something about the nature of this Maker, of this God. And it talks about, as a father pities his children, so the Lord pities those who fear him. And how God removes our sin from us as far as the east is from the west. Now that's in Psalm 103. That's a long time before Jesus was born. Yet I think what we read there describes the Jesus that we meet in the Gospels, who is the friend of the broken and the wayward and the unloving, as well as those who are not loved. He is their friend. And that's what we see in that psalm. And when she said, you need to, she's saying there's an urgency. This is something that we must do. She made that step lying on a hospital trolley in a corridor in a drafty corridor. I know that corridor well, of a hospital. It wasn't in a church or a cathedral. It wasn't in a religious service. It was simply her, with the help of someone else, talking to Jesus, offering him her life. She came as she was, that he would give her his life. And I think that was fantastic. And that's what we can all do. And then in Romans 8, there's great rewards for those who surrender everything to Jesus. If we give ourselves away, then our hands are open to receive what God has for us. And what he has is that nothing will ever separate us from the love of Christ. Nothing, neither life nor death, nor angels nor demons, nothing will separate us from him when we have that fellowship with him. So this is a little bit, and far from it all, about Muriel Heath. And I'm just so thankful that by these strange circumstances, our lives were brought together. Our relationship was different, I think, from a parent and a child. I never called her mother. I always called her Muriel. But we were friends. And she was incredibly different to me. We are very, very different people. But she taught me what it was, and I learned what it was to love someone that was just so different from me. And that was a good lesson to learn. And I really thank God that she was in my life. And I will miss her. So there it is.